Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 News. The pressure is continuing to pile on Sergio Perez, and not just from his own organisation. Lando Norris says that back at the Miami Grand Prix, where Red Bull started to feel the pressure from McLaren for really the first time this season, that was the Grand Prix where Lando Norris realised there was basically no threat from Red Bull for this year's Constructors' Championship based on Perez's underperformance. Is this type of statement going to change Red Bull's minds on exactly what decision they make for next season? Very much enjoy to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Lewis Hamilton will be getting a farewell from Mercedes at the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. What they're going to do is, I think 150 winners' names get put on the car livery, basically. So it's a nice little touch. Hamilton tweeted about it yesterday, and obviously people have been talking about it today. So that is going to pretty much signify the end of his tenure with Mercedes. Of course, there's been lots of talk because he's not been in the best form as of late as to whether Hamilton's in decline, whether he can come back for next season, or whether, he's at a point of just running down the contract, given the car isn't very good. And then next year he's going to be back on form alongside Charles Leclerc. It's a fascinating rivalry next year at Ferrari. Leclerc versus Hamilton is super intriguing. There's other good battles up and down the grid as well. I think I'm interested to see how Behrman does alongside Ocon in what might be a pretty competitive Haas. Obviously we've got Sainz Albon at Williams is a pretty interesting combination, and I'm really looking forward to Russell Antonelli at Mercedes as well. But speaking of Mercedes, Toto's been in some hot water over the last few days. We discussed his backlash, or let's say his backtracking to the backlash on his comments about Lewis Hamilton's shelf life over the last couple of days. But it's not just been this, and actually Toto doesn't stop talking about it. He says the following: "We're embarking on a new era with our senior driver George is turning 27 and our junior driver Kimi is only 18. We have two drivers together who are barely older than Hamilton is." That's very exciting. So, it's like, yeah, sure, I guess if you add the numbers up, that's not really, it kind of is true. I mean, it's not massively true, but it kind of is true. But it's just another one of these things that doesn't really help Toto's case in terms of maximising the respect there from Toto on his way out the door, or Hamilton's way out the door. We also have some further drama, though, today between Toto and Christian Horner. We're back. Formula 1 is officially back. Toto versus Christian drama is back on the menu. Now, you guys may remember this from last year, December 2023, when there was talk about Toto Wolff, of course, involved in Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula 1 team, which I think is what they're technically called, and Susie Wolff working with F1 Academy, the kind of like female side, in Formula 1 itself. And there was some speculation in the media that information about the future of Formula 1 that potentially could be helpful to Mercedes was passing between Toto and Susie, pillow talk type thing, basically. And this was seemingly baseless speculation in the media that was started to be discussed. There was no real evidence on this end as far as we understood. And then the FIA put an investigation into it, of course. And, once the FIA, the official governing body, starts such an investigation, there was, lots of reaction to say, wow, is this for real? The FIA saying that they were aware of media speculation centered on the allegation of information of a confidential nature being passed to an F1 team principal by a member of FOM personnel. They're looking into the matter. Now, this caused uproar at the time, and Susie Wolff, even after all this drama, then came out and said that she's filed a criminal complaint in the French courts on the 4th of March in relation to the statements made about me by the FIA last December. And, this is what she said back in March, based on what happened back in December. And shortly after this, Christian Horner said, oh, well, it was nothing to do with us. Definitely Red Bull didn't get involved in this, and put in a word to say, hey, you want to look into this, FIA. And it seemed to be, at least at the time, an overreaction from the governing body. The theory was that Ben Sulayem, not the biggest fan of Toto. All of a sudden, this speculation happens in the media that there's something they can maybe get them for. They look into it, and then every single team, basically, came out with a statement, you guys might remember, denouncing the FIA and the decision they made. So it was all over the place at the time. The interesting thing about it is that now looking back on this, apparently Horner was like the only man in the paddock who was not willing to yield on this. Now, I think Red Bull did eventually put their own statement out, but Toto did a kind of wide-reaching interview over the last couple of days, and he said the following here. So when all this happened, the response was great. I didn't make a single phone call to any team. Fred took it into his hands, Fred Vasseur, and said this is so unfair. From Steiner to Vasseur to Vowles, everyone jumped on this. they were ready to sign a document in our support, apart from Christian. And then Toto says that basically Horner tried to distance himself from the situation. As far as I understand it, he said, I'm having my own Sky interview, which we saw, and I'm going to say I'm not part of it. I'm not signing the document. The other 9 teams, though, agreed. But obviously he was advised that it wouldn't look great and he should be part of the statement. So, yeah, it's just interesting looking back on this. The Toto versus Horner drama will never go away, but potentially a little bit telling that looking back on that controversial moment, I'm not really sure there's been a conclusion yet to that lawsuit that we were talking about that Susie Wolff put into the court, so maybe there's still something happening behind the scenes on that one. But yeah, Toto, with all the drama that he's been in lately, doubles down on Horner and says that you just can't rely on what this guy says based on all the drama last year, and says that Horner was, despite the circumstances, and obviously, it was an opportunity for the teams as well to get one over on the FIA, because I think quite clearly they'd overstepped the mark in that probe based on the evidence that was available at the time, or at least in terms of what they said publicly, right? Because, the FIA looking into it, fine. To make a public statement saying you are looking into it, kind of implicating Toto and Susie Wolff with no real evidence against them, gave an opportunity for Formula One management, for all of the teams, to get one over on the governing body and say, hey, you've got to change how you're operating there, and effectively force them to yield and give some concessions back the other way, because it's a constant battle in this sport between the teams, the owners, and the governing body, the referees, effectively, and the decisions that they make, which aren't always the best, as we know here in Formula One. But that opportunity was seemingly not so keenly taken by Christian Horner, despite the opportunities at the time. But Horner's team Red Bull, they've been basically the big story of the last few weekends in many respects, because they're about to win one of the championships. They're not going to win the other championship. Their driver lineup is still a massive matter for debate. Now, as it stands, Colapinto is favoured to be getting the drive at Red Bull somewhere. The latest rumour was, a few days ago now, that Horner is keen to put Colapinto straight into the Red Bull racing car alongside Max. Marco isn't so convinced. He's more keen to put Colapinto in the RB and bring Lawson up to the main team. But the agreement seems to be between Marco and Horner that Perez will go, and his performance has not been good enough. Even in Brazil, where the car was better, he still didn't even score any points. Even on his good weekend in Baku, he still managed to squander it with the crash with Sainz. And sure, maybe it wasn't totally Perez's fault, but it was avoidable, I think, is what should be said about that incident. There's a feeling that Colapinto's going to get that drive. Alpine are interested too, but obviously Red Bull are going to be favoured. They probably have a bit more money that they could throw at this if they want to. The deal might be challenging to reach because Williams are not going to let him go easily. But if you were a betting man, right now it does seem like Colapinto to the Red Bull family somewhere is a realistic opportunity. And of course, if that does happen, it's got to be Perez making way somewhere, you would think. And of course, there's the other benefit for Colapinto, that he also has a big fan base and major sponsor backing from South America, which would, potentially alleviate the loss of losing Checo Perez and all that he brings in from the Mexican and also South American fans in general that are generally big Sergio Perez fans, and they sell lots of merchandise. Colapinto could be a good option there instead as well. And it's not just Red Bull that are having these conversations and are putting Checo at risk. Of course, we saw the other day that his father made comments which were not especially wise in the context of his son being at risk of losing his drive right now. And, well, Lando Norris seems to agree with that potential outcome. So a couple of things on Lando today. He had an interview here when the race asked him the question. We've seen with various drivers, whenever there's a clash with a popular driver, someone ends up getting pelted on social media. But I don't think I've seen a driver with such negative narrative against them as I've seen with you this year. We know that Lando has been catching flack, shall we say, for many of his mistakes. There was even an article that came out today that kind of described 12 key errors that Lando made this season, which have lost in the championship. It's been an interesting season for Lando because after the first 5 rounds, nobody thought there was a championship to be won. And Lando kind of had to try and switch into that mode mid-season. And obviously Lando's not done a great job at all, but his qualifying this year has been mega consistent. I've been very impressed with that. His race starts obviously has let him down. Some of his decision making and, on-track battles and stuff like that have let him down during the course of the season as well. But I think Lando will learn a lot from this year. I think he'll be stronger going forwards. But of course, there's always going to be questions about his mentality, because, you know, Max's mentality is very obvious. And it seems at the moment, if you want to win a championship in Formula 1, you've got to find a way through Max. And that's a challenge for any driver, let alone a guy like Lando, who was totally not ready for that type of challenge this year. So Lando says, I don't really know why that narrative has existed. You know, I kind of get it on some level, just because you guys remember the comments he made after Brazil. He was like, well, you know, they just got lucky. And it's like, look, at the end of the day, you've got to represent that Max just pulled off a masterclass, and you've got to probably sit down and watch that POV back to see what Max did that you weren't able to do. But Lando then said this today on the criticism that he's been getting: when people think my ego is too big or something, it couldn't be further from the truth, especially when I'm driving. So there's a big debate on this, and obviously fans are going to have their own opinion. Lando is still by far one of the most popular drivers in the sport, and I think it's true that for the Vegas Grand Prix weekends, you know, Max merchandise, the popular drivers, Lando's one of the most popular drivers in the sport, hands down, no questions. That's not going to change anytime soon. But this year's probably been the first time when there's been, you know, more negative press than Lando's ever experienced before. Okay, what do we think about the ego? Because you can look at his comment after Brazil and say that, you know, he didn't want to hurt his own ego by admitting that he failed in his performance, and Max had just killed him on a man-to-man level during the course of the weekends, which was basically true. But I actually think sometimes the problem I see with Lando is the other way around. I actually think he doesn't, like, have enough of an ego. I don't know. Every driver has an ego. Obviously, that's just how it's going to be if you're a top-level sportsman. But, you know, there's an argument to say that Lando needs to have more belief in himself on occasion. He needs to believe that he's absolutely the best man on track. There's no questions about it, because he's saying in this statement here that, yeah, when I'm driving, my ego isn't that big. As in, I give respect to my opposition, is how I'd read it. Whereas the actual argument for mine would be, maybe it's the opposite, right? Like, you think Max Verstappen doesn't have an ego when he's in the car? Of course he does. Like, Hamilton has an ego. All these top guys have an ego in the car, and so does Lando on some level. But I think that it's just a fascinating character, Norris. He really is. Like, of all the drivers and the champions have seen and multiple race winners have seen over the last few years, Lando is not quite like any of them. But as I say, right, the ego side, he's saying, oh, my ego isn't big in the car, but yet you can see examples where he does clearly have an ego in other elements. And one such example is one of the main dramas of today, the following. Lando says it's been clear for a long time that Red Bull are not a main threat in the constructors. They are currently, you know, 50, 60 points behind McLaren in the constructors. It's as good as over for them. Ferrari are 30-odd, 35-odd points behind McLaren. That is doable over 3 rounds, especially, let's say, Ferrari win in Las Vegas, as I would not be at all surprised if they did, actually. I think that this is the weekend where I can see a Ferrari win on the cards in Las Vegas, and if they were to 1-2 it, then, you know, the constructors is well and truly alive. And let's be honest here, if McLaren somehow leave this season with 0 championships, that's just an absolute embarrassment. So they need to hold on to the constructors for sure, now that the drivers is long gone. But Lando has believed for a long time that Red Bull were never going to be their threat. They always felt, at least for a long time, that it was Ferrari who were going to cause them the most problems. This is what Lando said, and you know, I think these comments again are pretty fascinating. After Miami, I already said back then our biggest challenge is not with Red Bull, it is with Ferrari. So no, there's almost no focus on Red Bull at all, which is funny because Lando has been outscored by Max Verstappen since Miami, and you know, that is quite a telling statement given the relative performance of those cars. But clearly, Lando knows this. Lando knows Max is great, as do we all. However, what does it say about Checo when after Miami, when McLaren realised that they had a car that was, for let's say the next like 6 or 7 rounds, the McLaren and the Red Bull were pretty even. And then after that, the McLaren took a step that the Red Bull guys couldn't match, and there were various problems, and we've talked about it this whole season, all the drama on Red Bull falling off and McLaren making gains. But this was basically the first rounds where we saw that McLaren had what it takes, and Ferrari that weekend were okay as well, and you know, they got better in time as well, certainly after the middle stint of the season, which wasn't that good. But it's kind of remarkable for me to hear that Lando says, after Miami, Miami, he was convinced basically that McLaren were going to win the constructors, and at least he thought that they would be in the conversation to win it with Ferrari, not even with Red Bull. Now, to be fair, it took them another 15 or so rounds to overtake Red Bull in the Constructors' Championship, but they did that basically just because Perez has been woeful this year and is 8th in the championship by a considerable margin. Max has almost 400 points. Checo has about 150, right? So it's not great. And Helmut Marko, to some degree, agrees with Lando here. Like, Lando's basically just cooking Perez there. And Marko says, if we win the title again this year, it will be mainly down to Max. With his exceptional driving skills, he has covered up the phases in which the car was really not good. I think he's meaning the drivers there, but and he's probably going to win the drivers. The constructors seems long gone, and that is the problem for Red Bull, right? Because let's say 10 rounds ago, they were talking about the fact that they were in a constructors fight, and they said, oh no, we'll hold on, Checo will refine his form, it'll be fine. That never happens, and now the constructors title is long gone, and Lando says they've realised that for a very long time. And when you've got Christian Horner saying that, well, the results on the track are going to do the talking and stuff like this, surely there isn't really much evidence to suggest that Perez could keep his seat for next season the way that it currently stands. But very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. The Las Vegas Grand Prix, of course, is happening this coming weekend. It is a Saturday race, Saturday night race in Vegas, let's not forget. That's Sunday morning here in the UK and many other time zones over across in Europe. We'll have a look at the timings here in a second. There's still some controversy about the race, obviously. They have absolutely welded down the drain covers this year, so presumably that's not going to be a problem. But as Marko says, the city's crazy. The slot machines, you have to pass on your way through the hotel lobby. The night is, the luck last year that the race itself was great, but the event didn't come close to meeting the high expectations. So, seemingly Marko isn't a big fan of it and saying that they had to arrive early and all these other problems with the Grand Prix. So, despite the fact that Red Bull won last year, of course, Leclerc absolutely cooked Perez on the final lap last year, famously at this Grand Prix. Let's see if Las Vegas can deliver a good spectacle of a Grand Prix weekend, at least from the racing side, as it managed to do last year. Just one final thing on Perez, I guess. These are the number of Q1 exits by each team this season. Ferrari have had 0 Q1 eliminations, which is pretty impressive for them, I guess. McLaren have had a couple. Mercedes have had 4. I think maybe 3 for Hamilton, 1 for Russell. Red Bull have had 5. And I think you can guess which driver was responsible for all 5 of those. And RB, Haas, Alpine, Williams, and Sauber with 32 Q1 eliminations. But Sauber this weekend apparently are actually bringing an upgrade. Now, it's pretty rare that I mention a Sauber upgrade because who really cares? But it is apparently important, this one, because they've had an atrocious season, obviously, and they have apparently dialed back loads of their other upgrades and dismantled them with the intention to bring one big package that they need to work. And if it does, they might be back for next year. If it doesn't, they are cooked, as is their technical director, you would imagine. But these are the timings. So practice 1, practice 2, they happen evening to night time on the Thursday, which is tomorrow night. These are the times of basically GMT, which is early morning for us. Practice 3, qualifying's at 6 a.m. UK time on the Saturday, and then 6 a.m. Sunday is the Grand Prix. So those are your timings. It's going to be an interesting race. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.